Hi students, in this video I'm going to talk about the state of the civil rights movement in the United States during the 1950s. We see that even as they return home from fighting as veterans in World War II, that African Americans are still subject to discrimination, are still subject to segregation all across the United States, especially in the South, but across the United States. A couple of examples of this, many of them do not qualify for mortgages with the same terms that white American veterans would. We find that many of these new suburbs that are supposed to be utopian communities forbid or ban the sale of these houses to African Americans to try and keep these communities all white. This is a practice that is overturned, condemned, and outlawed by the Supreme Court case of Shelley versus Kramer in 1950, or in 1960, excuse me. And so there is still segregation and discrimination against African Americans in the United States in the years after World War II. At the same time, this period also sees some important achievements reached by those who are trying to change this situation. One of these is a cultural achievement. The Brooklyn Dodgers are willing to hire the first non-white professional baseball player, Jackie Robinson. And Robinson overcomes significant abuse and discrimination to win the hearts of people who are following the team, and to show that it's possible for African Americans and white Americans to live and play in integrated lives. Civil rights were not a priority for Eisenhower and his administration. He's someone who's committed to civil rights, but someone who is opposed to the integration of the different racial groups in America being carried out or being imposed by government mandate. He wants this to be something that is achieved by working from the ground up, kind of in the tradition of a thinker like Booker T. Washington. And you've reached the stage by this point where this language of Plessy versus Ferguson, of African Americans being treated separately but being treated equally, has become kind of an established rationale for segregation, especially in the South. In the early 1950s, this is overturned by a couple of Supreme Court cases, Sweatt versus Painter in 1950, and then Brown versus Board of Education, more importantly, in 1952. Sweatt versus Painter established or condemned schools in Texas for being separate but unequal and demanded that the state remedy the situation. Brown versus Board of Education condemned any kind of segregated education. And the judges, in coming to their decision, relied on sociological data, which suggested that even if the African Americans and the white Americans were treated equally, the very fact of segregation would lead to a sense of inferiority on the part of African American children. And so you have these important judicial cases that establish the legal framework to achieve better racial integration in the United States in the 50s. They are nevertheless not really enforced. Eisenhower sends troops to Little Rock in order to force schools in the city to integrate, to force the schools to allow African American students to attend, but otherwise does very little to promote the decision of Brown versus Board of Education. Similarly, the Civil Rights Act of 1957 is passed by the Republican administration. It calls for voting rights for all, but it has little enforcement behind it. At the same time as a lot of southern states are nullifying or issuing statements that they are not going to respect Brown versus Board of Education. And when we get to 1959, we see that very few, if any, African American voters are added to the voter rolls from 1957 to 1959. And if we go back further to 1952, we can see that only 20% of the African American population in the southern United States was registered to vote. So widespread suppression of the African American vote. Nevertheless, decisions like Brown versus Board of Education energize African American activists to pursue their rights and their full integration into this society. It's at this time that we see Rosa Parks refuse to sit in the back of the bus in Montgomery, Alabama, where it was established that that was where non-whites would sit. This leads to a well-organized and successful boycott of the public transport system in Montgomery until a change is made. And it sees the rise of Martin Luther King as a charismatic leader of the civil rights movement, someone who promotes non-violent civil disobedience as a way of raising awareness of segregation in the southern states and across the United States, but also, and we'll come to this next week, someone who is not necessarily opposed to violent disobedience either. So that's the status of the civil rights as we enter the 1960s. Important victories have been won at the judicial level, at the legal level. It's full integration into American society, and the enforcement of these decisions by the American government, that still hasn't arrived yet. We still have to wait for that.